Okay, guys, welcome to another panel. It's part of the Digital Futures 2020 Symposium. It's happening in Zoom forums all across the globe. My name is Marika Trotter, and I'm joined by Ivonne Santoyo-Orozco and John Cooper. We are going to be talking about architecture and disruption. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of overview about sort of how we're approaching the conversation, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my co-panelists. So I think we've seen in the course of architectural history, and I can even just limit this to very recent events in the 20th century, that there have been several moments of deep and radical disruption. Revolution, chaos, the upending of established norms of teaching or established norms of even being in the world that have actually generated radical shifts in architectural discourse. One of those I would think would be the, what was called the February Revolution, although it took place in March, in Russia in 1917. Another, of course, would be May 1968. We've got Sanford Quinter joining us today, and I'm hoping actually that he might contribute to that part of the conversation since he saw firsthand the aftermath of that, especially as it took place in Paris. And then we've also had quite traumatic and dramatic events in the world that, at least so far, haven't seemed to generate fresh discourse or fresh ways of looking at the world. I would think maybe September 2001 would be one of those moments when it seemed as though paradigms should have been shattered and new ideas should have emerged. And instead, I'm not sure that that occurred. Certainly today, we find ourselves facing, in my lifetime anyhow, an almost unprecedented series of events, worldwide disruptions, including the COVID-19 pandemic, also the global movement for greater equity and justice around the world, and specifically here in the United States with our endemic racist and white supremacist institutions being challenged at all levels. And then, of course, smaller ripple effects, which of course feel very large to those of us who are in them, as it relates to architecture and architectural discourse and even architectural education. So just to read from my prompt to my colleagues, we're going to talk today about how architectural discourse can shift in response to sudden changes in the order of things. We've seen a lot of different approaches, from calls to action to experiments in content and form. That was particularly prominent, I would say, in Russia in the early 20th century, and then also in May '68, from new position pieces, which I imagine many of us will be pinning even now, to investigations of history, which has certainly been an interest of mine today, and from manifestos pulled from the zeitgeist to reckonings of loss. And I've actually been listening to a little reckoning of loss even in my discourse here, where I teach at SCI-Arc in Los Angeles, California. In our current time of trauma and change, we find ourselves with a wide array of precedents from which to draw. So this roundtable begins from the position that ours is fundamentally a crisis of the collective imagination. And certainly that is my position. I'm happy to have that challenge by my colleagues. In this light, can we usefully distinguish between substantive alterations to disciplinary thought, which are necessary, I think now more than ever, and the lip service and opportunism that flourish in moments like our own? Does new thought inevitably arise in crisis? Are old models destined to fade? The aim is to address these questions this evening in a thoughtful, provocative, and specific way. So just let me introduce my two colleagues, one of whom is literally my colleague and another is a friend at a sister school. So John Cooper is a member of my faculty, the History and Theory faculty at SCI-Arc. He came to architecture circuitously via a series of prestigious institutions. He studied English at the University of Cambridge and art history at the Courtauld before he was elected a Mellon Fellow at Yale, where he did his PhD. The Dancing Image, which was a dissertation on African history and culture, and specifically the spatialization of dance. He also then proceeded to work with Diller Scofidio and Renfro in New York as he began to turn his attention to questions of space and studied architecture at Princeton University. His research and teaching in the history and theory of architecture is rooted in the practice of fieldwork, which is actually not something that we hear architectural scholars say very often. The production of apparatuses, the representation of the unrepresentable, specifically ephemeral things, I imagine, such as the way the body moves in space, and investigating the radical potentialities of the metamorphosis of the body in space. Cooper's latest work analyzes the problem of the representation of the moving body in two dimensions in the late 18th and early 19th century colonial visual culture in India, England, and the Caribbean. Ivonne Santoyo-Orozco is an architect, historian, and theorist. Her research explores architecture as an interface between contemporary forms of governance and capital, something that we're now is being brought into the public attention in light of current events, I imagine, in a way that feels maybe more consensus building than it has in the past. She is currently at work on an architectural genealogy of property regimes in Mexico. And her publications include From the Right of Housing to the Right of Credit, The Drama of Ownership in Mexico, Potemkin Infrastructure in the Avery Review, which is awesome, I read that. And among others, The Apparatus of Ownership, another very good piece that was published in Scapegoat. And as an architect, she's collaborated with Arup, Foster & Partners, Will Aretz, and Fernando Romero. Her background is from the AA in London, and she also got her MArch at the Berlage Institute in the Netherlands. She has been teaching in the art history department as a professor of architecture at Bard since 2019. Thank you both for joining me today. And just to give you a little background about myself, my name is Marika Trotter. I head the History and Theory Department at SCI-Arc in Los Angeles. My own background is in architecture all the way, from my professional training and practice for a number of years, through to more theoretical work that culminated in my PhD at Harvard University several years ago. Now, I think one thing that I'm hoping today, given our very, I think, diverse backgrounds, even the places that we studied and the people that we studied with, is that we can really think broadly about even what architectural discourse is. I probably will have the most narrow disciplinary view of that. And I would very much like to try to expand our notion in light of contemporary events. Maybe what John, actually with the, in the context of the piece that I know that you just recently wrote for Log, which is probably the premier publication for architectural discourse, certainly in the United States.
Yeah, you'd like me to speak a bit about that piece?
Well, I just thought maybe it would be an interesting way to start thinking about what we think discourse ought to be today.
Well, you know, it was a conversation, and it's not the transcript of a conversation, but it has multiple voices, and then at certain points I felt that I didn't want to write by myself, or that the project of self-writing was, to me, I mean, I guess you'd say I'm just entered into the discourse, into this world, into this apparatus. It seemed to me there's something about writing by oneself, which was, I don't know, almost compromised. That there was I felt such a sense of perilousness about one's own voice becoming co-opted, not so much by discourse, but by a market of discourses. That one way to step outside of that or work in its undercommons would be to speak with and alongside another voice. Someone I kind of knew, but had only just begun to be known, so that one's voice was inherently modified by the condition of dialogue. And we were writing, this is Mira Henry, who's design faculty at SCI-Arc and co-principal of Current Interests. And the piece really originated in her research on what she called a not famous building in LA. A bank in the kind of neo-Mayan style by Donald Stacey Judd. And the work really became about producing new readings of space through conversations, not just between two voices, but intercultural conversations between references, some of them embedded within the architecture itself, some of them produced by the dynamic context of the urban interchange and cultural life of South LA in which that site was situated. And so to me, when one speaks about discourse, as Bart reminds you in A Lover's Dictionary, can you hear me all right? It's not freezing up, yeah. That discourse comes from discursus, the origin to kind of run around, to move around, to be kind of set in motion. And so this, we spoke in the article about a promenade architectural, that one had to kind of wade through space, kind of together, displace oneself, go out into the world, and have a conversation. In other words, to position the whole project of discourse creation outside of, or just separate from, the individual scholar working on their private project. And so to me, to directly answer your question, Marika, to me, the question of contemporary architectural discourse is inseparable from the question of methodology and the extent to which one experiments with new forms of writing. And maybe, at later points in the conversation, especially being at SCI-Arc, I've begun to really kind of question what it means to write. And what the production of discourse means, because the kind of writing that gets done at SCI-Arc is written in code and in software and in bio-writing machines. And I'm very interested in how one responds to all of these things kind of as a theorist, like with the pen. And is there a sense in which the whole disposition, identity, praxis of the writer has to become kind of radically rethought outside of the single author article?
Yeah, wonderful, John. So many things to unpack. I'm just going to jump in. It's very interesting. You're situating the process of writing as a way also of listening to other voices. And I think that's also what we have to do today, right? Like there are a myriad of voices that are on the streets that are calling us to listen. And the question is whether architecture has actually listened to those voices, and if we are ready to kind of to follow through with the radical change that is being called. And of course, I'm speaking specifically in the context perhaps of the States, of even more so perhaps of the East Coast, and of course in the context of the simultaneity of a pandemic and that disproportionate effect that it has had on Black, Indigenous, and peoples of colors, right? And I think one of the questions that Marika is bringing to the fore is how is discourse shifting, and how are we generating discourse? How do we generate new kind of reactions to this moment? And to me, one of the perhaps way to do this as an architectural theorist is perhaps to pay attention to the terms we use. And perhaps I would like to pause here for a moment in the question of disruption. And perhaps what does that mean is, and just perhaps to play a little bit, perhaps with the same terms that we've been given, I would like all of us to think, is this the right term? Is disruption what we're listening from a virus that perhaps is perhaps not just disrupting, perhaps to me, perhaps it's not just simply a break. Yes, the virus, perhaps the pandemic wants to proliferate, wants to spread, but really what is revealing to me, and the way I understand the pandemic, the virus, is almost like an X-ray of sorts. It's an X-ray that is allowing us to see historical structural problems. Structural problems that we have ignored, and that's why I was really sympathetic, John, with the question of like, are we listening to these voices? So to me, this virus is also acting as a way of seeing the inequalities that we have built into spaces across centers, right? And of course, if we put that together with the protests that are happening throughout the States and in fact throughout the world, not only simply calling for questions of police brutality, but also calling for really the structural inequalities that our systems of knowledge, including our own, have perhaps perpetuated. To me, it brings the question of how do we understand disruption? How is disruption really is it just simply disruption? To me, disruption is related to a state of normalcy. Is related, and I think there are a lot of questions that are arising of whether we have to come back to the new normal. And I think the provocation that Marika is bringing is this is a moment of radical transformation. So perhaps the terms are not somehow disruption, but I'm wondering, and perhaps this is a way to kind of come back to Marika to see if there's something more radical at stake, if perhaps we're talking about destruction, or that involves perhaps more of what we're seeing. I also perhaps have a cautionary note, remembering perhaps that disruption has been perhaps a term that has been co-opted, and of course I'm not a technological expert, but disruption has been very prominent in questions of technology. So it's very related to questions of innovation, right? So we often hear, the tech world talking about how certain technologies emerge and disrupt other technologies. So it's really related, kind of like it's inscribed within a certain kind of technical and economical discursive network. And that's why I'm kind of curious if it's a new term, unless we can think about really disrupting this. I feel like disruption in kind of in the kind of technological kind of sphere is doing something that perhaps this movement that are happening on the streets are rejecting, which is on the one hand creating new economic markets, and perhaps this technological disruption, one of the things is doing in creating new markets is perhaps augmenting social inequalities that we already see, right? So, you know, like questions, for example, that we're experiencing in logging into this conversation, that we know that not everybody can join the conversation because not everybody might have access to this technological medium, right? So I'm just curious to kind of like put on the table the question of disruption and kind of like the terms of our conversation. Is it, how do we listen? And maybe coming back to John's wonderful comment of listening to other voices. I mean, when we see on the streets that there are people protesting, that in a way the call is that there's one world that is dying and there's another world emerging at the same point. How do we imagine that we can use the same tools of analysis, the same tools of design, the same methodological tools in a way to answer to these changes? I feel in my particular case that we are asking not so much to retool ourselves, but actually to unlearn and to unsettle the very forms of knowledge that we have perhaps learned. So, yeah, so I'm wondering in this context. Yeah, I'm wondering if perhaps Marika, maybe it would be wonderful to see kind of how under this context you kind of understand if you can imagine the notion of disruption really describing our particular moment.
I like your caveats about the term. I have a kind of funny story about the way the panel got to be named that. I was chit-chatting back and forth with Neil Leach about doing this, and I suggested, he was like, well, what do you want to call it? And I was like, how about Architecture and Revolution? And he reminded me that he actually produced a book of that title a number of years ago, relating to one of these moments of upheaval. And so it was just kind of a funny moment. And he suggested Architecture and Disruption back to me, and I like the title and I stand by it, because actually I'm not willing to lose entire bits of vocabulary simply because they've been used badly or problematically by other discourses. I am indifferent to the connotation that may come from big tech, except to say that disruptive change in that sense is not necessarily tethered in any stable way to unjust regimes. I would say that, you know, one of the things that we ought to be very careful of in academia is our tendency to kind of cloak ignorance of technological developments and technological possibilities in a kind of moralistic dislike of technology. And then actually, as the discourse shifts, in my opinion, we are going to have to use every single tool available to us to try to be as creative as other instincts are to be destructive, not disruptive. So in the service of creativity, I am more than happy to harness big data and as much scripting and coding and neural networks, cognitive neural networks, whatever else that we can possibly marshal to our cause. And I'm always a little bit concerned when people that are engaged in our discipline, which is, I would say, unavoidably a very tight, like almost colloidal mixture of technology and techne on the one hand, and what the Greeks used to call the noble arts on the other, shy away from the other half of what we do. I actually think that's a real issue in discourse, and something that I want to change myself. Is I think we need to get real specific about the apparatuses that are involved in how we do what we do. And actually, there's a huge front of untheorized stuff there, and this is what something John was saying as well. Now, one more point. And that is, and sorry, one more point, and that is that I have been hearing a lot, and it's been good talk, if you know what I mean. It's been kind of noble discourse and necessary discourse about dismantling power structures and being anti things and taking things down and taking things apart. And I support that. But I think we remember that ours
breaking up.
And we have to be involved in building. We have to be involved in making, and we have to be involved in imagining others that happen. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Really good.
Can you hear me now? Sorry, I was getting very preachy. I
think the Chinese government censored you, or maybe, as I heard happened in our session at some point. I'll give you a signal. You got your cell phone next to you? You're blocking. I guess it's getting hung up again.
Marika, can you say something?
Yes, I can say something.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back. You're back. Oof.
So anyhow, I don't know what you missed, but I was getting very preachy about ours being a creative discipline and ours being something that has to be involved in building and not dismantling. I'm not saying that we can't participate in dismantling as well, but it's just not what we're that good at, honestly. And it's so much easier to tear down power structures and tear down sort of faulty edifices. And remembering the kind of dual etymology of that term, to edify is to build, than it is to build new things.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that response. It's funny that way, like sometimes things get named, and I appreciate the response. I mean, I'm both an architect. I'm on both sides, and perhaps that goes against my perhaps you know, my own kind of. I think it helps me articulate better what I think, because just as you mentioned, I mean, I'm interested in retooling also our capacity to act, but I'm also really conscious. I mean, I'm not shying away for the use of technologies. However, I think we have to ask for whom are these technologies, right? And who is being disrupted if we go and we continue going with these terms. And yes, I mean, I sincerely don't think that it's so easy to topple, you know, to transform the systems we have, because we haven't done that. We haven't done that in if the streets are correct, we haven't done that in 500 years. So it's not that we are there. And I think part of our job that I actually think we are good at is at reading space. We know how to read a space. I mean, it's not, we know how to read, you know, space speaks of inequalities, it speaks of opportunities. And I think we are kind of, as architects and with the tools we have a wonderful capacity also to communicate to other disciplines what we know. And I think perhaps in this moment, and perhaps kind of like thinking about kind of the waves of discursive transformations that we have had, and thinking in other moments where we have been more introspective in our discipline, where we have been more concerned with creating our own disciplinary boundaries. I think, if I might say, this is an interesting moment to look outwards without losing disciplinary specificity, to say we actually know, we can understand what is, from a spatial point of view, what is happening. We can read it. We can read inequalities. We can read segregation. We can read structural racism through our own tools of analysis. So I think that is something that we already would, and perhaps we just have to kind of like bring that into the curriculum, bring that more into the classroom, because it's already there. I mean, we have seen already how much of the discourse has already changed, even before
Well, yes,
COVID.
100%. That's like, oh, I was just going to say 100%. It reminds me of the kind of forensic architecture position, yes, whereby architectural skills are used to unearth crimes and also true injustices stamped onto the earth and stamped into the built environment, and expose those for people to see. And I think that's really important work. And I think that's, that's, again, you're right, it falls into our core skill set. But I also wonder, it always seems to me like a service that a few can make in the context of an institution that can support that work. It doesn't seem to be a kind of larger model for architectural practice, again, because it isn't creative. If we're not designing the built environment, who is? It's not going to cease to be designed. It's just not going to be designed by us.
I feel like, disruption is maybe one of like a family or constellation of rupturations. And I mean, you can disrupt something, you can interrupt something, you can corrupt something. And then I suppose you can erupt. Maybe there are other ones I've missed, but eruption, I think, is maybe interesting to consider as an alternative, because when something erupts, of course, it's very disruptive. It produces like catastrophic rupture. But at the same time, it produces flow. It reorganizes the context in which it emerges and produces new fertilities. I mean, as one of its potential outcomes. It seems to me that actually, Paul Preciado has this idea that counter-sexuality, that in the first sense, of course, it's counter as in against. It's to destroy the power structures which exist. But at the same time, the heteronormative world of constraints and power and domination and discipline, whatever. But on the other hand, it has a positive sense, which is to produce a new world of pleasure knowledge. And I'd say that's the eruptive part, that the kind of, excessive orgasmic explosion of creation is very disruptive, but then also it kind of leaves it produces a new ground. And so I'm wondering if disruption is too heavily weighted on the kind of destruction, and if corruption is the forensic project, then maybe the eruptive mode is the one which is most appropriate for architecture. I mean, you've got to explode, but then it's going to produce a different ground condition for a new world to be built.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the enduring metaphors for the cataclysmic reordering of the state of things that was the French Revolution was a volcano erupting.
Yeah, exactly. Liberty pouring out of it.
That's right. That's right. I love that. I think that's a great formulation. I also like the other spelling of it. So there's the eruption, like a volcano erupting, and other things erupting. But there's also IRR erupting. which is that kind of, I think it was a more of a popular term a number of years ago, and we were sort of on our Deleuzian journey in architecture. It has more to do with like the sudden occurrence of things in the world that are actually very difficult to explain, except by a really a deep knowledge of the systems that we're working like under the surface, right? And then something comes into being, a mold or an organization or a pattern or a life form.
Yeah,
a sudden arrival into the universe.
I think what is perhaps interesting about perhaps imagining other terms is that it brings us back to a question of collective imagination. Or you Marika, made a proposition that if this disruption doesn't kind of transform our discursive mechanism, it will show a crisis of collective imagination or something. You frame it along those lines, and I think, I mean, my concern, and I am more than happy to jump into the alternative worlds wagon. I'm ready for that. But I think before we do that, I am more concerned that we hear and that we resituate historically the moment, because in architecture we're really good at transforming sociopolitical questions into problems that can be solved. And as soon as we begin to add, to see architecture on the lenses of a problem solution, then the collective imagination, as you are framing it, is gone. I think it's just a little reform of what is there, and I think that's my worry of this moment. I think that we have a very interesting opportunity, but if we do that, it's only really because we have the capacity to trace this back in history, to resituate, and to me, in a way, the past, the present, and the future are inseparable. So that perhaps that's why I'm trying to really kind of like pause and trying to understand really what is happening right now, like almost to think together, what is this moment that we are experiencing, and based on how we analyze it, how we analyze this present, to me is how we go back and how can we imagine new futures at the same time. So I think to me that disruption is both, and that's why I don't know if any of you have read recently a recent piece, a recent op-ed by Arundhati Roy, the amazing Indian writer. She wrote about the pandemic as a portal, and she speaks about how pandemics have always it made openings to transform them. And she speaks about the pandemic as a portal, as a gateway between one world and the next. And it's a wonderful piece, but to me, really what it's bringing is a portal that can be closed as well. So I think to me, like we're seeing in matter of months, our spaces transforming in such a way that I think there's been a lot of sorrow and there's been a lot of misery, and but it's also a very positive moment of political transformation. And I think, and perhaps kind of my call is that the small kind of problem I see with the concept of disruption is that it comes back to, its reference is the normal. And the question is, what is this normal that we are referring? And if we can move beyond thinking that we're disrupting the normal, because the normal was not okay for so many people. The normal was the problem. So I think, to me, perhaps eruption, as you, John, is saying, perhaps kind of like seeing this. I almost want to come back to your original title, revolution. I don't think we're over that, but I think it's an interesting moment to take this portal that Arundhati Roy, and not just to kind of reform our existing and include other voices that have not been there, but actually to kind of like to reconsider what are our cultural values, our values as architects and as architectural producers and architectural thinkers, and as spatial producers, right? You're muted.
What I feel is, am I?
No, you're good.
Can you hear me now? What I feel definitely is that it feels like the work, and I think this is what makes it exciting, even though, as you said, Ivonne, it's also a very sorrowful time and a very stressful time. But what makes me excited about it is that the work that seems to lie in front of us seems to be so immense, and there's so much to be done, that I second John's feeling of not wanting to write alone. I'm much more interested right now in doing collaborative projects and thinking together with other people, not because I don't have anything to say myself, but because this seems to be the issues that we confront on so many fronts right now are so deeply interwoven that they require more than one intelligence at work on them. And that, I think, could be a very, forgive my invocation of the term again, but it could be a very disruptive kind of practice for our field, which has long valued the single voice and the individual designer, without understanding necessarily, or without taking into account the myriad other kinds of knowledge or kinds of intelligence or kinds of creativity available, which I think puts us in the mode of kind of being exhausted, lonely figures, sort of locked in a narrow battle for limited platforms. And it seems to me that one of the advantages that is emerging in this changing time is the sense, and I don't think I'm alone in this, the sense that it's all hands on deck.
Yeah. Isn't it like a bit of a sort of King James Bible moment? Yeah. I mean, that there's an urgent need for the production of a kind of discourse to re-legibilize the mysteries to a population. I mean, there are many this is a very problematic analogy in some ways, but I mean, in the spirit of the all hands on deck, that there are certain kinds of projects which can't be done alone, which have to be done together for the purposes of a larger collective. That's just, and it's not even kind of glorious work, like kind of actually anonymous work. But I mean, I think, this is something that really interests me, is like what, and because you referred to forensic architecture too. And I mean, I kind of agree with what you were saying, Marika, but it has, that is clearly a collective project. It's a form of writing, or speaking, communicating, which necessitates like people kind of working together. And so the idea of the collective writing project and what that means, I mean, I don't know if Sanford is there to can be called upon, or is an auditor, but I'd be very, very interested as someone. I mean, Sanford, I think I had the pleasure of speaking with you once very briefly, and have had the greater pleasure as well of reading your work, but just respect the building up of, well, just many years of writing, but how you understand maybe this moment in comparison to the other moments, I don't know, of comparable crisis, and seeing how people have responded and what's come of their response and what's come of their like ideas and enthusiasm or whatever, and did things revert or did they change? Or oh, you're muted.
Yeah, is it all right if I speak from here? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I was going to enjoy this and not have to do anything here. Well, first of all, I'd like to say from where one thing I noticed during the pandemic, and there were moments of incredible anguish in New York City, as you guys can perhaps imagine, in late March. And frankly, it wasn't a lie that there were vultures flying over Manhattan, that the gases from the dead were there to be registered by the animals, but it was also true it was dark. Now, what I did notice though was, because I was in contact with all kinds of people in different places, and I also was lucky enough to get out for about 8 weeks, or shall we say in and out for about 8 weeks, to a beautiful place, very safe and in the country, in a beautiful, beautiful place, etc. But what I noticed is how one's consciousness radically changed each time, and how everybody's experience, especially because we were confined, everybody's experience was hyper cued to the specific environment that they were sheltering in. Whether these were friends in Los Angeles who were still able to take hikes, this was, or whatever. And I noticed that my own brain and the emotions associated with it were so radically pegged to where I happened to be, and how quickly, frankly, the experience of the world changed really within a single hour. But I would say, all told, I've lived longer than ever the rest of you, that's for sure. I've gone through moments in history that were considered epical, but this one I'm 100% convinced its main operation was to transform us. And I can feel it. I can feel it like I would be shocked if this time there was a reversion. That's all I can tell you. This is a personal thing. You guys, I can tell you this, you're in LA. I'm in touch with many people in LA. You've had a very easy time of it. I'm not saying that in any critical way, of course. I know things are getting worse, but it's understandable that you would doubt that what's happening could possibly be the greatest single social and psychic transformational event of our lifetimes. It feels like that here, and I've been moving around. I'll tell you something. It seems inconceivable. And by the way, we still have demonstrations every single night here in New York. I can even tell you, I could take tiny little incidents, like, for example, the work I had to do, not only to find a bicycle for my son, but to sell our bicycles, to help others, because I'm interested in bicycles, frankly, and help others think their way through negotiating getting a bicycle. I can tell you something, there's no doubt about it, that everything is going to change, even on that level. So I could say to you guys is that everybody's going to have a slightly different sense, let's just say different capacity for credulousness. But what is happening now may not be the worst thing that's ever happened, but this is a transforming event. I tell you this, it would be the shock of my life if there was a reversion. That's what I mean, or let's say that there was a real contraction that brought us back to where we were. I simply feel profoundly convinced of it. And I have to say, I'm going to be a little sad when this is over.
Well, the question of when is over, I think, is relevant. I hope this is not over. And that's why my kind of apprehension of taking the term disruption, because I don't think we're going back to normality. And I don't think that's where we should go. I don't think this is a disruption. This is going to be something else. This is calling for a new, alter. And I say it perhaps also because I'm also in New York.
You're in New York. Oh,
I'm in upstate New York, but I'm equally going to protest nearby. I'm being as safe as I can, but I recommend to all of you that can. People are on the streets not because it's a moment to just just ask for a little reform. It's something else what we are experiencing. And I think perhaps this is informing, like when we see on the news, when we see all over the world monuments being destroyed, this is also part of how, like, this is speaking also to something that we're supposed to have certain level of expertise, right? The question of symbolic orders and like it might be, this is one of these moments that what is the reason why these monuments perhaps are being toppled and destroyed is not because we're calling for new monuments. It is precisely because there is an opening. So perhaps the answer are no monuments. And I think and I love the idea that Marika is bringing about of this is a moment to think with others, to be in conversation. And I think for architecture is also a moment to reach out to other disciplines that perhaps we have as a discipline alienated ourselves, defining our autonomous boundaries, defining the terms of our own kind of values. And I think this is perhaps a very interesting moment to speak to other disciplines. So, but I'm curious how, Marika, you see it.
Well, okay, so first of all, okay, I see the point on disruption. If disruption seems to imply that I think we're going to go back to the old normal, I agree with you. I'm so heartened to hear what Sanford had to say about it, Sanford, because you experienced the real revolution in thought that occurred after May 68, which did not ultimately bring about a broader revolution in the way we do things. So that was exciting to hear.
Marika, maybe I'll say one thing. It's weird that you just mentioned 68 because that's what I was thinking ever since I stopped speaking. But I have a different thought on that, and that is what I was in Paris and for most of the 70s, and I was so impressed as a young man or as a very old adolescent. I was so impressed that everybody discussed the transformations that had happened in their life before 68 and after 68. So I would say that in a specifically rigid society like France's, as opposed to the American one, the transformations that got triggered in 68, those were definitive. My experience of French culture in the years, they were definitive. The French society and institutions were transformed. Now you may have, I think you have most of the world on your side by saying that 68 didn't transform America. It's not the way I like to see it, but I'll go with you.
Well, it did. I'm sure it would have been different without that. It's just that perhaps my generation sees it as also a bit of a portal closed, to go back to Yvonne's metaphor, that there was a certain amount of transformation that happened, but there were too many people decide not to go through that door, maybe is the way to say it. And, in terms of the mode of production that seems to be ahead of us now, I am the most excited about things that seem freshly available rather than things that seem the urge to dismantle is perhaps a necessary part of this, but it's not going to end up being the most important part. And I think there's also a distinction to be made between sort of reckoning, a disciplinary reckoning, which seems that we have to do that if we want to move forward, and save the expertise and the discourse of architecture from the kind of disgusting parts of itself. But at the same time, I'm more interested in things being thrown out into the world as kind of seeds or as generative moments. Then what I don't want to see happening is a retreat to intra-academic academic politics. I don't want to see a retreat to a kind of a contest about who can be more right, or who can be the most woke. And I don't want to see academics kind of tearing each other apart in this moment, as opposed to getting out there and helping people think new thoughts about what we can do and who we can be.
I just want to say one thing as a boomer, and I apologize for that. I have to say, confess that what I miss is thinking, public thinking, especially big ideas. And, you know, it's just not the age for it. But I remember lining up once, I was really young, 16 even. I remember lining up once for a lecture of Herbert Marcuse in Canada. And I remember experiencing something that I've never, well, that I certainly don't expect my kids or anyone is going to experience again. And the memory of revolution is often the memory of how you lived ideas. So frankly, it's something where I get bewildered. I can't find my way in it this time. But I do realize that my life will change. And I expect that to hear that from a lot of people. The emphasis on life, how you're going to live.
Yeah, and as we understand more about how we think, how we live is not an inconsequential thought. It's not a separate discussion. How we live is also how we think. Literally.
You know, a revolution without books is a strange one. It's a strange one. It's a revolution with Zoom. It's a revolution with what is it called? Crowds, whatever, swarming. It's a revolution of social media. Forgive me.
I don't know that we won't have books.
Oh, books are not a prominent part of the revolution taking place now.
Yeah, no, that's true. TikTok. Actually, that's deep. That's actually deep. Why? Because the most impressive and inspiring things I would recall from today's perspective of the last 3 months was the Rolling Stones synchronizing a beautiful performance of their song on the, I don't know how many of you guys watched it. I'd be shocked if you didn't all watch it. Did you see the big show of, yeah. And first shows of Saturday Night Live showed the unbelievable ingenuity of being locked in a room and inventing from that perspective. It was astounding what they could do. I mean, I couldn't work at all. And I frankly confess to you, I didn't do a stitch of work. But to see these people pulling stuff out of their kitchen drawers that were, you know, hilariously brilliant and funny, just blew me away.
Yeah. I agree with this. One thing that I am myself also missing, and I really appreciate Marika for the opening, because you're allowing us to think together, which is something that we, in our lockdown and isolation, we cannot do. But you know, there are also other. That's something's not happening, but something that I have noticed that is happening, that is something really beautiful, that it can also be a form by which we organize ourselves in the planet, is the networks of care that are emerging. You know, I have been surprised in any ways of how networks of solidarity, of care, of reproductive labor have emerged that we didn't have before. We had restricted to feminists, perhaps, discourses, and now perhaps there are more coming to the fore in with social strength. that I think, for example, there is an opening. There is an opening by which we can reimagine how we live together, perhaps not based on the parameters given by a client, but by parameters based on networks of networks of care. And so in these kind of other portals that are being opened, other forms of imagining kind of the production of space are also emerging. And I think this is also one of these really interesting things that are happening. I see a lot of thinking, we have seen a lot of kind of op-eds and a lot of articles coming from our discipline trying to reimagine the 6 foot distance. And I think, well, that's totally relevant. I appreciate that. It is also interesting, might be also interesting to take also these networks of solidarity and care and trying to reimagine how we might move beyond the 6 foot and how we might live together otherwise. So that is something that is happening. Another thing that is also kind of like that dissemination, for as much as we miss conversations, the dissemination of knowledge that we're experiencing is very interesting. I have actually feel that I have not enough time. Also, I have a child, so that's doing summer like the job and summer camp in the same house and doing this doesn't kind of make any sense at the moment. But I mean, right now, all the events are open, just as this one. That's just something incredible. That I think is also kind of like certain kind of voices that were not, were perhaps they didn't have that much spaces. Now they have it. So I think that's something actually really, really interesting.
So John, that was very specific. Thank you, Ivonne. I really appreciate that. I hope we can get out. It's one thing that's been troubling me about what often passes for discourse in architecture these days is we seem to be locked in this kind of aphoristic mode of saying things that we think are generally true without actually coming up with specific ideas. And so I really appreciate, Ivonne, the specificity with which you just spoke. Okay, that's an idea. Like, you could write an article on that. You could generate some discourse on that. And it would have spatial implications. Would it be enough for a new aesthetic? Probably not. Probably you need to have another component to the idea that would address a sense of novel aesthetics. But it's hard to come up with, locked in our rooms as we are, it's hard to come up with generative concepts. And that one I think qualifies. I really appreciate it. John, I'm wondering if you have something also that you might think would be a productive direction for us to go in.
Well, it's funny, I was thinking just in terms of writing and the kinds of, when you speak about the kinds of labor, reproductive labor that one might be engaged in. And, I don't know what it's been like in the other institutions represented here, but, recently at SCI-Arc, been a lot of conversation around structural racial injustice and how one responds like on an individual, a collective, and an institutional basis. And it seemed to me like two kind of things started to get produced really, really quickly. One was kind of shared Google Docs of resources and readings produced, by like 50 people, everybody kind of putting in their references there, and like every kind of institution seemed to generate one, and they had different styles and different levels of conventionality when it comes to referencing and formatting and whatever. And then at the same time, a much more kind of closely worked over project of writing of kind of like draft new statutes, new kinds of equity and discourses on equity and inclusion. And I feel, you know, that to me, that's interesting, that the emergency response to a kind of crisis, in this instance, I don't know, at least in my small circle, was not to produce discourse, but it was to produce sort of like kind of field manuals, kind of handbooks, resource lists, bibliographies, and sort of statutes. So one was kind of operating in the realm of like the strategist and the legislator. Not the legislator as in the one who kind of controls and judges, but the one who kind of facilitates new organizational structures or something. And so yeah, that I mean, I thought that was a really kind of like an amazing thing, I thought, about this kind of moment, that you started doing that with people you didn't even know, and you know, they would just appear as like an anonymous tortoise or anonymous wolf cub, you know, in your Google Doc avatar list. And that to me, it seemed interesting. I mean, I don't know, like I felt like it was the first moment of kind of global emergency that I felt like actively involved in a really, really major way, as opposed to something kind of outside of myself. And I feel like however one reflects and meditates on stuff, when you think about like what you actually end up doing, what are the forms that you actually end up working with, I thought the things that, you know, it's like buying toilet paper. You know, what is actually the emergency critical discursive operation that you do? Like, it's, you know, I think it's kind of fascinating to see what people default to, and what under, like, what everybody I feel like is under. Well, I don't know, maybe this is different for different people, but I felt like there was one was never busier. There's an amazing sense of like urgency to kind of quickly produce stuff, but not big ideas. It was to tweak small articles, or to kind of figure out where to place a reference alongside the references that other people were generating.
Yeah, and I think that's I share that, John, maybe just because we've been working through this at the same school, but I think the emphasis on format over content is very telling to me, and is not one that I'm happy to see, because to me it represents the academic apparatus work trying to save itself, sort of like trying to kind of keep things not disrupted or not eruptive, and not transformed. And content, I think, here is going to be more useful for us to work on than format. I don't care how many reading lists we put together on topics of equity and inclusion. If we don't change our thinking in response to reading even a paragraph from one of those, it won't matter, will it?
Mm.
And our changing thinking, again, and you know, this I'll you know, we put it on my tombstone. It's a crisis of the imagination. We need to change the way that we're imagining. We need to change the way that we're generating.
I'm kind of perturbed by this phrase a little bit, because it seems to me like I feel like I'm someone who maybe like lives in the imagination. At least I feel like I've been accused of that. So if one says that like it's a crisis of the imagination, I feel like lost, because if your imagination doesn't, like, that's what I work with. So if there's a crisis in that realm, and you can't, like, if your imagination's broke, you can't get out of it. So does that mean like that you stop imagining, that you've got to do some, you know, if your imagination's broke, what are you going to work with?
But you know what?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I feel like our imagination is intrinsically related to our memories and our backgrounds and our history. So we have the imagination that we have, you know, that that we have managed to to get. And if you are lucky enough to have gotten to the right schools and have gotten more tools, then that's the imagination. Your imagination is. But I think this is an interesting moment. I don't know. I mean, kind of this this exchange of knowledge that we are seeing, I think is something magical that you know, like talking about the use of new tools, right? There are indeed. I mean, look, I'm a theorist, and on the other room, I have 4 3D printers working, making steel PPE. You know, so I'm not against this. I just think that we have to ask questions to those tools. We have to ask how, you know, like who benefits, like how are they entangled in economic questions and social questions, and how do they differentiate subjects? Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think our challenge perhaps as educators is to bring this wonderful conversation into the classroom. I think, you know, at least for my students, they don't care about terms like equity or inclusion. They care that we bring the voices, and that we speak about the issues that matter. And they are perhaps more attuned with our political landscape sometimes than we are. Mm-hmm. And I think it's our responsibility. And the sadness here is whether we question our own education, whether we were given the tools that we need now to respond to this. And I feel like over and over, and I remember Mark Jarsonbeck in a recent piece speaking about I self-educate myself in order to speak about questions of labor. I don't remember what recent piece I read by him. And I think this is perhaps happening again. So we're in this collective learning process that also involves unlearning a lot of things that have caused enormous kind of trouble in the world. That you know, but I think I don't know. I mean, I myself feel like it is a very interesting moment where you know, like, yes, architects cannot bring change by themselves. We cannot. We need a political system that comes with that. At the moment, I'm writing a piece on common lands in Mexico. And I'm trying to kind of, you know, the editors keep on asking me to not just write the historical part, but to write kind of like what new openings it is. And in looking into the question of what are the new openings, what you quickly find is that without uprisings, without a true political force, there is no sometimes radical change. And perhaps we have seen it in our historical moments. And it's something that we also have to remember, that yes, we cannot do it alone. We are embedded, you know, like to make a building requires capital, requires labor, requires construction materials, extraction, energy. It's not a building, it's not just the design, it's not just the aesthetic question. The aesthetic question is loaded with other kind of invisible things. And that's why I think that these ways of seeing architecture through kind of like a multi kind of layer way, which is something that the virus allows us to see, is perhaps something we can recuperate and bring to the classroom.
But I do think it's also important for us to remember the role of aesthetics in the world, and this is something that I've been saying this recently, because it's almost like you have to argue for the position in a way that maybe in older regimes that deserved to be dismantled, one did not. The connection here between aesthetics and the way that we form judgments in the world, the way we decide on our ethics, for instance, is quite clear, I would say. And so it can't be that we think aesthetics is an additional thing or something we resort to when we're not 3D printing PPE. And it also can't be that we resort to a sort of solutions deprived of that expertise. I think that the core expertise of architecture is aesthetic. and cannot be simply about solutionism, right? I don't think any of us would be arguing for solutionism, but just to be clear about it. And so John, just to go back to what you were saying about, the kind of the way that you feel lost when I try to frame this as a crisis of the imagination, I'm not necessarily talking about the crisis of the individual imagination, although certainly many people are experiencing that. I'm talking about a general cultural imagination with the keenness and excitement to think things otherwise than the past and the present tell us they will be. And that is something that architecture is actually quite good at.
Yeah, but do you mean to say that it's a crisis of the architectural imagination, or like a general cultural imagination?
I think it's both. I don't think that you can really separate out the architectural imagination completely from other forms of imagination. I do think that architecture has fallen into certain routines of thought that don't seem that productive anymore.
I mean, I don't know if anybody else saw this, but I mean, in a way, along the lines of the Rolling Stones. But over this weekend, a film by Arthur Jaffa, "Love is the Message and the Message is Death," was screened on a rolling loop in a whole series of galleries spread throughout the world. And like for a moment, the kind of world was encompassed in this piece.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't think there's a crisis of imagination when you see that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
when you're talking about when you're talking about, so I love that example. You're right. It's really powerful.
It's pure imagination. It's made out of images, and the images themselves are the connective tissue among themselves. It's like conceived in a beautiful, continuous 7-minute act of imagination that ties together 500 years of history. And
no, I think we're talking about it cross purposes though. So I just to clarify my remarks, what I'm talking about is it's the kind of groove of the imagination that thinks about the world in terms of scarcity and necessary inequality, let's say, or in the kind of hope that somehow if you recycle properly, the flood might not overtake your residence. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about these spectacular works of art, and the one that you mentioned is an awesome example. And also we have some spectacular works of architecture too, that are desperately trying to breach that. But there is a very big disconnect between the work of the let's say, to use the old term, the artistic genius, and we can think of that collectively as well as individually, and the habits that collectively keep us where we are, stuck in some kind of hand sanitizer and PPE regime with, as Ivonne says, no hope of exit.
Well, maybe just I feel like I sympathize with Marika in the question of the opening to reconsider collective imagination. We're seeing changes so rapidly that we're almost forgetting that it was almost yesterday that people even knew what ideas like defund the police. What is that? They suddenly everybody's talking about that. What does that even mean? I think that I think comes with yes, our imagination is transforming, it's changing, and I think it's collectively changing. And I think this is interesting. I could not have a conversation with my parents-in-law about this, and suddenly, a very average, citizens, they know about this. So I think there is something to be said about how we build a collective consciousness. And I think part of that is linked to how we imagine possibilities, because, and then perhaps to come back to kind of my questions of the networks of care, a lot of people that are calling on the same way for other systems of organizing safety are saying, related in relation to kind of the cries to defund the police, are really bringing the question: what will it be again? Kind of a city that is organized through institutions of care. I mean, I'm not actually, when I'm talking about care, I'm not saying anything new. Nothing new. It was said in the 60s, and I'm sure Sanford will have much more to say about this than I have. Silvia Federici, was. Go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to. I mean, I think it's really inspiring to hear those things said, and I want to say, like, Marika, when you say the crisis of imagination, is it also like, does one dare think that actually could happen? I mean, also maybe what Sanford was saying before, like, is this the one? Is this
I think it very well could be. I mean, I think like part of the issue that we tend to have in today is that our desires are too small.
Yeah.
I think our desires are too small. I think we need to desire bigger things. Really, really, really big change. And actually, this seems like the opportunity is there for us. We can get out of the like I said, like the exhausting modes of a tiny tweak to the system. Like, oh, well, let's maybe we can make a new hire, or we can advocate for everyone putting their preferred gender pronouns at the bottom of their email, or whatever the thing may be. And those things may be good and necessary, but they are small.
Yeah, no. I'm very curious what's going to happen with a lot of schools. We have seen a lot of speeches coming out of the deans of major universities. It's a very interesting moment, also with the voices that are coming from positions of power within our discipline, right? Not just showing solidarity, but it seems like also showing a true commitment to kind of rethink the way we think architectural, like how we analyze the spaces, really basic questions, right? How we coexist, not just between people, but with non-humans. So I think, I don't know, I'm really curious to see what is going to happen with our curriculums, with our, and what kind of projects the students will be producing. But I think with that, there has to be a lot of, we cannot stick, perhaps, we have to discover new references, new kind of frames of departure that we didn't perhaps consider even being relevant before. I think that's going to be very, very interesting, yeah.
Yeah, John, I'm really curious. I know you've been thinking a lot about the production of digital spaces for collaboration. Everybody's facing something just on a very basic level. So how do you teach? What opportunities are involved in moving to online platforms? For many of us who teach seminars, we know that we'll be doing that in the fall. And John has been really sort of surfing the outer wave, it seems like, of how lectures might become more inclusive and more interactive, how ideas can spread laterally through the classroom rather than just from the instructor to the students, and maybe sometimes regurgitated back to the instructor. And then it goes beyond just teaching methodology, right? It also is the production of new knowledge and new forms of imagination. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, you know, when I was, I recently came across a file format called .fbx. And one of the ways that it's written up in the, like, I'm not a computer scientist, by the way, this is kind of novel. I was kind of thrown into this through like the circumstances that Marika was just describing. When you look up FBX in kind of the literature, the way that it's described in computer science formats is that it's has the quality of interoperability. And it's a format, a file format that has, it can be animated. It can contain animated content. It can contain, you can translate sort of OBJs and meshes and all kinds of standard 3D modeling formats into FBX. And when everything is in FBX, it can all inhabit the same space. It can interact. They can be jostled and linked together and connected and flowed and whatever. And, you know, I came across this, you know, as Marika will know, in the context of the curation of an exhibition, which was originally conceived to be a physical exhibition in a gallery displaying architectural models, and then had to be switched to the digital. And whilst it had been conceived in its standard physical format, I had begun planning a procession so that the works of architecture on display, they would arrive into the gallery space as like part of their itinerary, as kind of objects in movement with a trajectory. And this was part of the way they would be kind of received and encountered and negotiated with. Anyway, when that was translated into, when that had to, at the end of March, when that had to become digital exhibition, the task then became, what kind of a online, publicly disseminable spatio-temporal container can you produce that that maintains heterogeneity? Because, you know, like we're experiencing now, digital spaces, they tend to homogenize stuff. They kind of like flatten and homogenize to one format. And, you know, I became very interested in, you know, I guess now people are kind of messing with that and finding ways to work around it and kind of restore something of the kind of the Noah's Ark of life. And, you know, Unity, for example, is one of the great platforms that I think is emerging, which kind of just runs on interoperability and FBX. You can dump anything. I mean, that's why it's called, you know, a software that's called Unity. It's like, you know, a unifying theory of the universe. Like it promises to include everything, and indeed, you can cohabit 3D models, still ones, animated ones, images, videos, audio, motion capture, interactivity. There is a lot that goes into that stuff. And so it seems to me that what is, you know, we're talking pedagogically to kind of, you know, frame it as you had done, Marika. I feel like where maybe the real like radical innovation is happening is in, or will happen, or the horizon of it, will happen in the kind of complete reimagination of the archive as a space of cohabitation of all manner of things, and that the accessing of that archive will be totally open to all comers simultaneously, and that the archive can be trashed and exist in its perfectly curated ideal state. Like everything can be thrown on the floor at the same time. It will also be exactly where it's supposed to be. And I think that space, especially when it can be infiltrated and interacted with, like Fortnite, if any of you know, like any kind of, you know, multiplayer game where a world can be stable and rearranged at the same time. I think that world is a pretty exciting one, and is going to make institutionally, pedagogically, archivally, culturally, and then its consequences for cultural memory and everything in that regard, Ivonne, that you were saying earlier, I think that is also going to be pretty powerful. And so that's where, I mean, you were talking also about unlearning and relearning. And I certainly feel in the position where I've got to learn all of that stuff, because that's where everything is going. You know, what's that thing from Zola, you know, this will kill this. Well, now, you know, Unity, TikTok, Fortnite, they're going to kill the book or whatever it is, the article, the standard way of doing things. So I'd say it's in that kind of the kind of performance of the archive online together in a game, or however it's going to figure out. But that's where stuff's going to happen. And that's where the crisis can be prolonged, I think, where this, if it's this disruptive energy, can be kind of continued on its own steam for a long time, multifariously. I'd say that's the reason. That's where I'd lay my bet right now.
What a lovely vision for us to end on, I feel. I too am optimistic about the idea of being able to have multiple repositories that function together or separate. Because for one thing, I think it opens history up. And Ivonne, you were reminding us, we're not going to be able to build new possibilities for the future without freshly evaluating our histories. And of course, those histories are multiple histories, and many of them have been extinguished or excluded or suppressed. And so finding ways to get that material out into the world and in circulation as we begin to think together and converse together and discourse together is going to be crucial.
Yeah, no, this has been, thank you. This has been a really wonderful way. I mean, I feel like there's still so much to unpack. I'm sure it's very late for everyone at this point. I mean, definitely in a pitch dark room. But
the sun's going to rise in London in a couple of hours. So.
Okay. Okay, so you are in good shape.
I'm still in daylight.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, that's very good. Yeah, so this is, I mean, this is also really, I mean, that our production of knowledge is transforming so much, you know, from the fact that we can all be in a conversation to kind of, yes, I mean, the question of archives, how, you know, like some of us haven't been able to go to an archive in a year. So the process by which we need to speak to one another and to kind of like find ways to kind of interact are so crucial. And I think we do have, again, kind of like a coming back to what is our kind of, what is the role of our discipline? Yes, we do. I think we do have, I'm not concerned in looking at other disciplines and kind of learning from kind of like other forms of their histories. I'm not concerned myself in losing disciplinary specificity. We do have, we understand very well, as long as we understand not only what space, the questions of creation of space, but what space produces and what space divides, segregates, differentiates, entangles. I think if we know all these different adjectives of what a space can begin to do, I think we're in good terms. But I think we still have a lot to give to other disciplines and the way that we can read our current historical moments as also a question of space. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you both. And thanks, Stanford. He's I don't know if he's still there or not, but thanks, Stanford, for engaging in this conversation. It was great to have you here. I really appreciated this conversation, and I was glad to have it with you too.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, John.
Right, here we hang up.
Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.